This is an audiobook reading of the Brock Eastman book, Taken. It is the first book in a 5-part series. Chapter 1.0, Prologue. I implore you not to do it! The man clasped his hands before him as he pleaded with his friend. It isn't...
It's entirely my fault. I should have kept it. I might have saved her.
His friend rambled. He was out of his wits, lost to all sense of reason.
It's the only way. She must be preserved,
he murmured. She's dying. You must let her go. Your grief is consuming you, and what you seek cannot be found. The first man warned. She didn't want...
Don't say it.
The second man cut him off.
She didn't know what she wanted. She was sick.
Fear and anger shook his body as he spoke. It's not natural.
But it's possible, and it's the only hope I have.
No, there is a greater hope. If only you would listen to me.
Enough of your foolishness, Samuel. I want to be alone with my wife.
Just think of her, and what she would want. The grieving man placed his face in his hands and began to sob. Samuel stepped forward to confront him. Had he been able to get through? He placed a hand on his friend's back.
No, I want you to leave. I've made my decision.
The man yelled and stood to his full height.
Leave me.
Samuel turned to leave. If only his friend would listen. What he discovered would not produce the results he wanted. Samuel understood the fullness of the text, but his grieving friend would not listen. He asked how Samuel knew, and Samuel replied, Faith in the truth. Faith was not something his friend understood. He needed solid evidence. He needed something tangible, something real. Chapter 1.1, Shock. Oliver stood alone beneath the endless night sky, pondering what lay ahead. In a few minutes, his family would leave on an expedition to begin an archaeological dig. Normally, this meant they'd be neck-deep in ruins and ancient artifacts. But his parents were hiding something, and Oliver didn't know why. They weren't usually this secretive. 3 soft beeps sounded from a device on his wrist. For the 7th time in as many minutes, Oliver glanced at his M-Talk. It was already midnight. Not surprisingly, his parents were behind schedule. He sighed, realizing he'd have to finish packing by himself. His family was scheduled to launch at 12:30. There was still a lot to do. Oliver hurried back into the cargo bay and started stacking the many crates and supplies. One by one, he set them in place and strapped them down. As he inspected his work, he wiped the sweat from his face on his sleeve and noticed his bicep bulge beneath the fabric. He'd just turned 17 and had spent the last year under the physical training regiment of the academy. He wondered whether he could have completed this task by himself a year ago. He subconsciously rubbed his fingers over the academy squadron badge stitched on the sleeve of his t-shirt. A feeling of belonging and pride came over him. Something clattered in the hall of the upper deck. Oliver scowled. Mason and Austin were probably fighting. At 11 years old, they were adept at finding opportunities for mischief. Their sister, Tiffany, was supposed to keep an eye on them, but she'd probably fallen asleep reading. Why was he the only responsible one? He wondered, irritated. Oliver's boots clanked against the metal stairs as he climbed to the balcony overlooking the cargo bay. As he looked through the raised cargo door, the wind blew a variety of autumn leaves over the open bay. The breeze gave him an eerie feeling, and he shivered. Something felt wrong. Where were his parents? Walking down the corridor, Oliver stopped and looked into the research lab. Sure enough, Tiffany was asleep on the couch. Her hand grasped their mom's Archeos e-journal, its screen still glowing. Oliver understood his parents' need to document every minute detail of their archaeological digs in the journal, but he didn't understand his sister's obsession with reading through the myriad of notes, boring descriptions of glass shards, scraps of metal, and soil samples. Oliver glared at his sister and gave voice to a sigh, hoping to wake her, but it didn't work. She had one job: watch the twins. Oliver felt the warmth in his cheeks. His temper was rising. He'd been making strides in controlling it recently, but when it came to his siblings, he had to work extra hard at keeping it in check. Oliver crept towards the twins' cabin. He was sure they'd be jumping on their bunks or throwing things at each other. He couldn't wait to nail them and make them clean the galley or lavatories for misbehaving. Surprisingly, their cabin was silent as he approached. The boys were fast asleep, Mason on the bottom bunk and Austin on the top, one leg hanging limply over the side. With a disgusted glance at the messy cabin, Oliver pulled the door shut. He had grown accustomed to the rigorous order kept at the academy. Oliver glanced at his M-Talk. midnight. What was keeping his parents? He stomped back to the cargo bay in frustration. A lot had changed since he'd been gone. His parents were acting differently. Were they mad at him for going to the academy? He really didn't have a choice, since all males had to serve at some point. They should be proud of him for being admittedly early at 16, a truly rare privilege. And how long had they been hiding things from him, he wondered. The more he thought, the more bizarre his parents' behavior seemed. They'd picked him up from the academy in an unmarked, expensive silver ship. While it wasn't unusual for Oliver's family to inhabit a ship for expeditions, it was strange that they hadn't mentioned the Phoenix earlier. Who had beefed up their budget so they could afford it? He didn't even know where they were going on their current expedition. That was very odd, and there was no sign that anyone from Archeos, the society his parents worked for, would be joining them on this trip. Oliver flexed his muscles, reminding himself of physical strides he had made over the past year. He stepped outside and tapped his M-Talk to call his dad. Mr. Wick's picture appeared on the screen while the M-Talk tried to reach him. The call was rejected, and the screen went blank. He couldn't believe it. Not only were they late, but now they were ignoring him. Oliver felt his temper rising again. He'd have to fly back to the house to see what was holding them. They were never going to leave on time. His black sky scooter hovered outside the Phoenix, waiting to take Oliver wherever he needed to go. He swung a leg over, and with a twist on the throttle, the craft quietly darted forward. 10 minutes later, Oliver could see his home, a collection of 7 connected domes. The quiet night ride had calmed him, even though he was still anxious to get going. Suddenly, Oliver heard a strange noise. What in the world? Letting off the throttle, he killed the engine. It was men shouting, voices he didn't recognize. What was happening? He pulled the sky scooter off the main trail and slid off the seat. Oliver cautiously crept up the trail toward his house. There was a large black transport ship hovering over his front yard. Ropes hung from the sides. There was more shouting. Someone was issuing orders to search the house and grounds. The backyard was empty, so Oliver was able to race to the garage unobserved. Once inside, he locked the door behind him and approached the next door that led into the kitchen. With a slow turn of the handle, Oliver pushed the door open a crack just large enough to see through. His dad and mom were there, but they weren't alone. A stranger stood in front of his parents. His face was shadowed by a black pilot cap, but Oliver could see the faint line of a scar on the man's cheek. He wore a black uniform, covered by a long black trench coat. 3 silver stripes decorated the upper part of his coat sleeves. That meant he was a captain. Directly above them was a patch with a silver skull and the word Ubel. Ubel. Oliver had never heard of them. What was going on? His parents seemed confused too, or maybe shocked. They'd definitely been caught off guard at the man's arrival, and the men shouting? Something was wrong. This guy wasn't a guest. He was an intruder.
"What brings you here at this late hour, Captain Frederick?"
Elliot Wick asked. Oliver's dad held his hand behind him, and his mom grasped it. Even in the midst of this frightening intrusion, their love was evident. They drew strength from each other. "You know why I'm here?" Captain Vedrick's voice was low and raspy, like a snake's hiss before it strikes. He approached Oliver's parents and looked around the kitchen. A satisfied smile slipped across his lips.
You weren't expecting us until tomorrow.
Mr. Wick nodded. We hoped it would be a few days.
It would have been easier if you'd accepted our offer,
Vedrick said with a scowl.
But I suppose we're past that now.
He rolled his shoulders and exhaled.
Where are your children?
Mr. Wick straightened, standing protectively in front of Oliver's mom. He remained silent. Vedrick smirked and narrowed his eyes.
We know that you picked up Oliver from the academy, and Tiffany, and the twins from Bewalter.
Oliver's chest tightened when Vedrick said his name. He didn't like the idea of this man knowing so much about his family. What else did he know? Oliver knew he had to stop him. Maybe he could knock him out and help his parents escape, but he had to find the right moment, a moment of surprise. Vedrick shouted over his shoulder,
Search the house. There should be 4 children somewhere around here.
Oliver scowled. He was not a child. Footsteps echoed down the hall as the house was searched. This was his chance. He was ready. Oliver grasped the door handle, and almost as instantly he stopped, and his grip eased. He remembered what he had learned about balance of forces at the academy. He was clearly outnumbered and would likely be captured if he attempted a rescue. Taking a deep, calming breath, Oliver waited and watched. His heart drummed rapidly. Mr. Wick shifted backward. He was purposely blocking something from Vedrick's view. Of course, it was the book. Oliver's parents had shown the book to him when he returned. It was the one thing they had shared with him. Covered in crimson leather, the book was the prize find of their last dig. Mr. Wick hadn't let it leave his side. Now it sat exposed on the kitchen table, like a beacon calling to be seen. Vedrick moved toward the garage like a fox on a hunt. Mr. Wick looked toward the door and made eye contact with Oliver. His expression tightened with fear. Fear for his son, not for himself. Mr. Wick stepped forward abruptly. Vedrick spun around.
Don't try anything stupid. The compound is surrounded. There is no escape,
the captain hissed. Oliver felt his heart drop to his stomach. What could he possibly do? He had to act soon, or even he would be captured. Vedrick sighed and leaned against the kitchen counter.
My superiors are quite interested in your work, you know. For some reason, they feel you are essential to our destiny.
He smiled haughtily.
You should have accepted their generous offer and saved me the trip to this scrap of a planet.
Oliver's mom, Laura Wick, spoke up boldly. We can't be bribed. Vedrick's eyebrows narrowed, and an unsettling darkness crept across his face.
It wasn't a bribe. You should have considered it your salary.
He held out a hand and tightened the strap of his glove.
People can always be bought.
As quickly as the darkness came, it disappeared. The captain shrugged.
There is no choice now.
There was never a choice,
Mr. Wick said.
True, I suppose, but a willing partner is always better than an unwilling one. Regardless, I've been assigned to escort you on this expedition.
Vedrick's chin rose proudly.
Together we will discover the truth.
A soldier walked into the kitchen and waited for the captain to acknowledge him. The man shuddered under Vedrick's annoyed glare.
What is it?
Clearing his throat, the soldier lowered his head.
Sir, all the bedrooms are empty.
Vedrick slammed his fist on the counter. The darkness had reappeared.
Where are the children?
They aren't here, Mr. Wick admitted. The captain looked like a wild animal choosing its prey. His eyebrows bored into Mrs. Wick.
Where are they?
Mrs. Wick responded with confidence and strength. It's true, they're not here. Vedrick angrily turned to the soldier.
Search the woods behind the house. These people never lie. It's against some code they follow.
The soldier went into the living room and issued new orders. Oliver took a deep breath. He had to act now, or the woods would be swarming with Ubel soldiers. He looked around the garage for a weapon, but found nothing. They had taken everything to the Phoenix. Oliver heard Vedrick's serpentine voice.
We know your recent discovery has revealed the whereabouts of Ursprung.
You're mistaken, replied Mrs. Wick. As our report stated, Mr. Wick clarified, the discovery at Dabness Castle leads no further than the last known location of the Glaubiggers. Vedrick began to pace.
You speak truthfully, but there is more to the story.
He turned his back on Oliver's parents. The captain carelessly opened a cabinet and then slammed it shut, continuing his seemingly unfocused yet persistent search. Oliver remained frozen. Only an inch of wood separated him and the captain, who was but 5 steps away. "What do you mean?" asked Mr. Wick, trying to hold Vedrick's focus.
Well,
turning back to Mr. Wick,
it was previously believed that the Glaubiggers had nothing to do with Ursprung. But we know differently, now don't we?
Captain Vedrick laughed menacingly.
You underestimate my resources.
Vedrick moved to the table and took the leather-bound book in his gloved hand. He held it out and cackled.
And what have we here? I saw the book the moment I walked in, but watching your efforts to block it has been amusing. As if you could hide it from me.
A sarcastically sympathetic smile crossed his lips.
This book, this priceless book, is how I know the Glaubiggers are linked. The existence of this book was revealed to me just 4 days ago.
Vedrick looked at Oliver's parents, who were stunned. It was clear they had not expected this.
And now I find it lying unprotected on your kitchen table.
Oliver felt anger boiling up inside him, but not at Vedrick this time. Had Oliver's dad shared with him the danger they were in, he could have helped protect the book. Instead, it was clear to him that his parents had been careless. Mr. and Mrs. Wick recovered their composure. Their family's safety was all that mattered. Mr. Wick inhaled. Well, now that you have what you need, kindly leave. Vedrick smiled deviously as he wagged his gloved finger.
No, I don't think so. You see, we still need you.
The finger now pressed against Mr. Wick's chest.
As you know, it's believed that in an earlier time, the Federation prohibited research into Ursprung, and with a single keystroke, all electronic records that mentioned our origin were deleted.
So this Ubel group wasn't part of the Federation forces. They were something else. Rogues, mercenaries, thieves, something dark. Vedrick stepped away from Mr. Wick and shook the book with his hand.
Discovering ancient artifacts like this book is the only way we can recreate the information that was lost.
Oliver understood. His parents were renowned archaeologists who specialized in the field of origins. These villains needed their expertise. Mr. Wick shook his head. It could take hundreds, if not thousands of years to explore all the abandoned settlements scattered throughout the Federation. You'd need hundreds of teams working for you. Vedrick set the book on the counter.
We don't need to explore every settlement.
And raising his eyebrow, he continued.
We already know where the fabled path began. It started at Dabness Castle. The second waypoint is at the coordinates you discovered in the underground chamber. The very same place you were planning on leaving for tonight.
Oliver clenched his fists. This man knew more of his parents' plan than he did. He was furious. How could they keep this from him?
As archaeology experts, you are essential to our mission.
Vedrick continued.
Your expertise will be needed many times during this expedition.
We didn't accept the money, and our decision hasn't changed, Mr. Wick clarified. Mrs. Wick nodded her head. Money has never been a motivation for our work.
How noble,
he sneered. Mrs. Wick stared into Vedrick's cold, black eyes. We search for the truth, and its discovery is our reward. Vedrick stared with boredom at Oliver's mom, then ran his fingers across the book's cover.
My superiors believe, as do I, that Ursprung holds many answers. Answers that validate legends that became myths just a few centuries ago, and were historical facts only a millennium before that. You see, my society's desire is not much different from yours.
Oliver could see that his parents weren't buying Vedrick's motives, and neither did he. Ubel was after more than just the truth. But what? Vedrick continued his proclamation.
There is no greater mystery to be solved than where we humans came from. Our origin. The rewards garnered for any truths that you've discovered thus far cannot compare to what Urspring can unlock.
The darkness crept back across Vedrick's face, and his fist rose in anger.
And you know that,
shouted Vedrick, consumed with rage. Then a clever smile crossed his face, washing away the anger and darkness.
Perhaps I should share something with you,
Vedrick said. Walking across the kitchen, Vedrick turned to face Oliver's parents.
Many years ago, one of my superiors came across an artifact from the long-abandoned city. Do you know what was written on that artifact?
Mr. and Mrs. Wick just waited silently, paralyzed with anticipation as they cautiously observed the disturbed man before them. Vedrick looked toward the ceiling.
And I give unto them eternal life, and they shall never perish.
He spoke as if the words were tattooed on his innermost soul.
Do you understand those words?
But the captain didn't give them a chance to answer.
The secret to living forever is within our grasp. The secret to eternal youth.
The handle on the other door to the garage rattled as someone, likely a soldier, attempted to come inside. Oliver turned to see and shifted awkwardly on his left foot. It twisted slightly, and his shoulder nudged the door to the kitchen. He looked back to the captain instantly, but it was too late. Vedrick abruptly turned toward the garage door. A streak of fear bolted through Oliver. His stomach seemed to turn over, and his mind went numb. Captain Vedrick's cold black eyes were all he could see, and they were locked on him.